You are listening to MCC Votes and Seats, the podcast series of the Center for Political Science of Mathias Corvinus Collegium. We provide election insights with experts and politicians.
Hello and welcome to Votes and Seats. I'm your host Balint Toth, and today we are unpacking a somewhat unexpected turn in recent Dutch politics, the 2025 general election. Originally scheduled for 2028, this early ballot was called after the sudden collapse of the Schoof cabinet following the Party for Freedom's withdrawal from the governing coalition. The result? A political landscape shaking to its core. For the first time in decades, the Netherlands faces a virtual tie at the top. The Social Liberal Democrats 66 and the right-wing populist Party for Freedom of Mr. Geert Wilders are both projected to secure 26 mandates each in the House of Representatives. It's a historic moment for Democrats 66, marking their best ever election performance, while for the Party for Freedom, an ally of Hungary's Fidesz party in the European Parliament's Patriots for Europe group, it's both a setback and a reminder of the volatility of their voter base. To help us make sense of what these results reveal about the changes in Dutch politics, I'm thrilled to welcome political geography and sociology expert Dr. Jaap van Slageren, assistant professor at Utrecht University. Dear Jaap, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us to explore what might be one of the most fragmenting yet fascinating elections in recent Dutch history.
Well, thank you for having me. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, before we get into the numbers and what these results mean, I think it's important to take a step back and look at how we got here. The Schoof government came into power with a promise of stability and pragmatic cooperation across the political spectrum, yet less than halfway through its term, it collapsed, leading to these early elections. From your perspective, how would you assess the Schoof cabinet's overall performance, and what were the key factors that ultimately led to its failure?
Yeah, well, very good question. And I think we need to start with assessing how the Schoof cabinet came into play. So the last election in 2023 was already a landslide election, an even bigger landslide election than this time, where the far-right party, the PVV, became the biggest with around 25% of the seats. And at the same time, the biggest winner, so to say, the one that grew the most, was a party, Nieuw Sociaal Contract, or NSC, that highlighted a stable and reliable government. And therefore, I think the collapse of the Schoof cabinet was already embedded in the starting of the cabinet, because these two factors were not at odds with each other in terms of policy that much. They both wanted restricted migration. They both wanted a more center-right kind of economic policy with a lot of emphasis on the poor. But they did disagree fundamentally on how to get there and what kind of role the government should take, especially in relationship with the rule of law and the checks and balances. Where the NSC presented itself as the party of reliable government and protection of minorities against the government. At the far-right PVV stated that those protections hampered them to do anything realistic. So you can say it is surprising that Schoof fell so fast, but I would say it is surprising that they hold on so long. Because this tension already in the beginning made coalition building very difficult. They had a lot of special compromises, at least on paper, calling itself extra parliamentary, where the cabinet had more distance towards the parties to ease in the idea of a far-right party in government. Well, in practice, none of that was used, and the far-right party just claimed as if they were the sole rulers. This internal agreement was the major complication of getting anything done of the Schoof government. I think every person would say that the government was a huge failure because of different reasons. the major reason was that they could not internally agree on. They wanted a more migration law, stricter migration, but how to take care of existing rules, EU policy, they truly disagreed on how to handle with them. And the second thing, a very important thing here, is that we have a Senate, we have a two-chamber election system, and they did not get a majority in the Senate. There was a more center to right-wing majority in the Senate, but this would require compromise, the classical political debate on getting majorities outside of your fraction. And the PVV refused to do that. So basically all the policies, all the laws that they implemented failed because they refused to make any compromises to, for example, the Christian Democrats, who were outside of government but very sympathetic to their policy, and other more right-wing or center-to-right parties. So it did not really get anything done, and it is surprising given how many internal fights, how many ministers and junior ministers that walked away because of, for example, internal discrimination remarks in the a minister meeting. It is actually surprising how long this government took on or remained on. And this changed when the PVV lost in the polls. And given that they could not get their policy done because of this stance, the moment that they started to lose in the poll, their strategic choice was, if we let it fall because of migration, then we can at least have a big chance in the next election that the major issue will be migration. And we know that if the major issue is migration, the PVV will generally win. So they concocted a reason that the others were sabotaging them in their migration laws because it didn't have a majority in the Senate. And therefore, they pulled out. Saying that solved the problems in the government is wishful thinking, because the remaining three parties then started to fight over migration as well, because they wanted to show to the PVV electorate that they could actually win by getting stuff done. So they started to do this kind of traditional political handwork, but they all wanted to be in the spotlight and therefore couldn't get anything done either. That answers your question, right?
Sure. Thank you very much. So it wasn't just primarily ideological tension within the coalition or policy disagreements, but something way deeper about the shifting political culture in the Netherlands. Thank you, Jaap, that really have set the scene for understanding the political turbulence leading up to these snap elections. Now that we've unpacked why the elections were called, let's turn to who was competing in them. The former coalition parties, the Party for Freedom, PVV, the People's Party for Freedom and Democracy, VVD, I think, VVD, the New Social Contract, and the Farmer Citizen Movement, all saw their influence wane, with the New Social Contract losing many of its seats. Meanwhile, some of the traditional parties made remarkable comebacks. The Christian Democratic Appeal, CDA, surged with 13 new seats, and the Right Answer, 21, added 8 to their mandates. The margin between the two leading parties is the narrowest since 1956, I checked it, when the Dutch parliament last expanded in size, a sign of just how finely balanced the political mood in the country has become. So let's talk about the parties, the players and the politicians at the heart of this race. Which parties and political formations were running in the early elections, and what are their defining characteristics? Who are the most prominent figures, and based on the pre-election climate, what were their realistic chances going into the vote?
Yeah, I think, thanks for that question. I think there are quite a lot to discuss, because I think you're totally right. The difference between the first and the second has been never this small. But I think an even more important topic is that the biggest party has never been so small in the Netherlands as well. So we have a radical proportional system, and D66 won with less than 17% of the votes. So I think if we go through the parties, we can talk about what were their prospects on that and whether they would win or lose seats. But the question on what would be their prospects for government is a completely different one. And I think a lot of media also in the Netherlands presents this as D66 one is the biggest in a very majoritarian logic, like that the biggest is very important. But if the biggest has only 70% of the vote, the biggest is only a fraction of the seats. The far right PVV, that was the biggest the last time. This is the far right populist radical right party that already exists since 2006, and they supported government in 2010, and then basically were shunted out of any government coalition until last. So the last election, most political scientists say they won big time because the center-right parties opened the door for this party, saying we are considering working together with you, and their stance was therefore also way more collaborative, less confrontational, and also less constitutional, even though their starting stance was still unconstitutional. With this election, that completely changed back. Because of the failure of the Schoof government, it became very early on clear that basically no party was willing to work with them again. So their chances of getting into government is close to zero. And therefore, there was no benefit anymore for this collaborative stance. And they changed back to the more what we get used to, what in Europe is also shown with a lot of far-right parties, this confrontational, anti-constitutional, conservative agenda. Though their main stance has always been extremely anti-Muslims, Islamophobic, but also broader anti-migration. And they combine this with being more critical on journalists, being more critical on the judges and the rule of law, etc., etc. What we see with the other far-right parties, they were expected to lose from the beginning quite a lot because of the failure of the Schoof government and because of their small chances of getting into a next government. They were in the polls already from the beginning starting to lose. This is one of the reasons why they stepped out of the Schoof government. However, for a very long time, they were still the biggest in the polls. Completely at the end, that also dropped because migration became less of an agenda, and the main topic in this campaign was we need a stable government that is not fighting with each other anymore, and the PVV was considered to be most responsible for the disastrous Schoof government. So they were going to lose, and their chances of government is minimal. The second relevant party that I wanted to highlight is the party that was for a very long second in the polls, and that is the traditional Social Democrat and Green party, GroenLinks PvdA. This is the only big left-wing party of the big quote-unquote parties of between 12 and 17% of the votes, and they were expected to be the biggest after the PVV, therefore be the biggest in government, and therefore the most likely to present the prime minister. However, the leader of this party, Frans Timmermans, most people in Europe will know him. He was a very big player in the European Union, is extremely unpopular, not only by the radical right, because he's considered to be too cosmopolitan, too elitist, not out of touch, but also within the left, because he is of the rather moderate centrist wing of the Social Democrat, and this merger of Social Democrats and Greens has still a bit of debate on how strongly to the left should we be. This divide and the debate on the PM leadership made in the last day a lot of these left-wing people move to D66. This is the third party. D66 was not considered one of the main frontrunners. D66 has always been this party of basically combining voters from the center-right and from the left in this social liberally, very cosmopolitan, very pro-climate, but economically rather to the right kind of party. But in the end, besides getting a lot of the votes from the center-right, we saw a strategic move from the left to this party of about 5 to 6 seats, together with also some movement from the center-right, and that is why D66 shut up. And D66 had a campaign of being very optimistic. Their major idea was to build 10 new cities without making this very concrete, but therefore presenting itself as the anti-PVV, the anti-Wilders, presenting we are the party that can combine the reasonable middle. And although they were expected not to win that much, they were expected to be in any kind of government, which is not the case for the previous mentioned GroenLinks PvdA. But D66 was always deemed necessary. The other party that was always deemed necessary was the Christian Democrats, the CDA, as you mentioned before. The CDA lost last election historically, but this is our ruling party since the 50s, has always been the major ruling party, and they lost to what we mentioned before, the Nieuw Sociaal Contract, so the reasonable constitutional party. But with the lack of government capabilities of this party, a lot of these voters came back already. So they were really in a winning mood, and they presented themselves as reasonable, norm value oriented. For a very long time, the debate in the Netherlands was who will be the biggest after the radical right. Will it be the Green Social Democrats or the Christian Democrats? So it's rather a surprise that these 66. Then there are two more parties, if I may, that I can want to discuss. So first are the more conservative liberals, the VVD. They are also one of the traditional government parties, but they were also part of the Schoof government. And with the new leadership, they have radicalized really a lot, being anti-constitutional. And although they refuse to work with the radical right, take over the radical right agenda quite a lot. We will get later on what happened to them, because they lost quite a lot of votes, but they won also quite a lot of votes. So basically remained roughly equal size. The last party that is relevant to discuss is Jaap 21. So this is a party on the far right. This is a split of the what you called mentioned before, the extreme right Forum for Democracy, but they have presented themselves as a very reasonable governmental alternative, and therefore take the stance between the radical right and the center right position.
Yeah, they call themselves the conservative liberals, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And they basically say the radical right have a lot of good ideas, but they cannot govern. We have the capabilities. Their leadership also has its ties to our first populist party of Pim Fortuyn back in 2002. So they won 9 seats, which is not a lot. I would not consider them one of the big parties, but they are influential in what kind of options there are.
All things considered, the Dutch political landscape is famously diverse, with parties spanning the full spectrum, from progressive liberals to agrarian movements and populist newcomers. But these elections seem to have redefined the balance once again, with both established and emerging forces reshaping the playing field. Fascinating insights, Jaap. It's clear that the Dutch political scene remains one of Europe's most dynamic, with both new movements and traditional parties constantly reconfiguring their roles. Now, if we shift our focus from the political actors to the messages they've been putting forward, every campaign has a story about the country's priorities and anxieties. from economic uncertainty and housing shortages to debates over immigration, climate policy, and the Netherlands' role within the EU, a whole range of issues seem to have shaped the tone of this year's campaign. So let's delve into that.
To paraphrase the movie Parasite a bit, I would say the main message is there is no message. This campaign was more diverse in the major issues and major topics than ever before. Nonetheless, I do think there are important spotlights that we can discuss. So first, maybe a bit of characterizing based on the voters what the Dutch landscape is, because it is so fragmented, it is so difficult. But although on party level there is a lot of changes, we see with voting basically three blocks of voting. So we have the radical right, that is this more practically educated voters. We can talk later on like what their main kind of voter base is, but these are they are more practically educated, they are more peripheral, and they vote PVV, but also Forum for Democracy, and large part Ja21, what we discussed before. And although there is quite a lot of movement, that is one cleavage. And if you ask those voters what do they care about most, then it's migration. So one of the major issues is still the migration crisis in the Netherlands. How the migration crisis is defined differs between the parties, but basically all parties say that we have a migration crisis at the moment because there are millions, not millions, but there are a lot of people waiting in asylum places, waiting for housing, waiting for place to live, waiting for a visa or a green card. But what the problem is differs between the parties. So there is a lot of debate on whether we should stop or hamper migration inflows, and then mainly asylum on the radical right. And on the left and the center right, they also talk about labor migration. But especially on the left, they say, no, it is more of a solidarity crisis, that those places are drastically underfunded. So this is really one of the topics that is still dominant. It's less dominant than it was 2 years ago when everything was related to migration. But it is still among voters an important topic also in this election. The issue that I think is the ideological issue that got even more presence in this election was our housing crisis. So the Netherlands has enormously long waiting lists for social housing, and the prices of buying a house skyrocketed already for a very long time, but now we're also tackling the suburban places. And previous elections linked this very much to the migration issue. If fewer people come in, we need fewer houses. But this election, the debate was more on where to build new houses, what kind of houses should be built more, and whether we should remove the mortgage deduction that our government gives, which is basically free money for house owners and especially big house owners. And it is considered to be one of the reasons why housing prices grew so much. So this is actually the classical economic cleavage that is not the most dominant, but is surprisingly active again. And not surprising, the left party, GroenLinks PvdA, presented this topic quite a lot. But also the VVD, the center-right VVD, that generally has a lot of voters that are well off and therefore have big houses and have, if you're talking about mortgage deduction, a lot of benefits on that, presented this as well. And their main campaign was stability in your financial situation, not getting rid of the mortgage deduction. So that's the second ideological issue. However, and then I come to the biggest, I think the most prominent issue of our election was not an ideological issue, but was stable government versus chaos.
Okay, thank you, Dr. van Slageren. That was a really comprehensive overview of the campaign narratives. Now, to understand the election in full, we also need to look at where and from whom these votes are coming. The Netherlands, although being a beautiful but relatively small-sized country has always had a rich political geography, one that often mirrors deeper social, cultural, and economic divisions across the country. If we were to project the results onto a map, we'd likely see distinct regional patterns emerging. Strongholds for some parties in the urban west, others in rural or more traditional provinces. These differences often tell us as much about societal history and identity as they do about political strategy. So let's explore that side of the story. Which regions provide the main voting basis for each of the major political parties? And what do these geographic trends reveal about the historical, economic, or cultural factors shaping Dutch politics today?
There are, again, because we have so many parties, multiple answers to this. But the first and most visible pattern is, and this is here, the Netherlands is not unique, a growing of the rural-urban divide, and that coincides with the growing of the education divide and with the importance of migration and social cultural issues in politics, where you see that the big cities, especially the biggest cities, and we're talking about Amsterdam, then we're talking about Rotterdam, then we're talking about Utrecht and The Hague. The vote for the left, for GroenLinks PvdA, was substantially bigger, but also for D66 was bigger. Because D66 as a party can attract voters from both the left and for the center-right, their geography is also a bit more blurred in that sense. So the left, we clearly see this is urban areas. This is also more what we call the Randstad. This is the economic center, because these are higher educated, these are students, these are urban professionals. D66 gets both those kind of voters, so they were also the biggest in the big city, but also in the more suburban, well-off areas, where they took over some of the more well-off voters from the center-right. And therefore, their geography is a bit more, a bit less present as with GroenLinks PvdA, because they are generally the biggest with the big cities. But for example, in the province of Utrecht, which has the city of Utrecht, where they are the biggest and GroenLinks PvdA second, but also around that is a lot of high-tech industry, a lot of service industry, higher educated, but also well-off people. And with exception of like the Christian areas, D66 won basically in every of the municipalities in this province. So it's both suburban and urban, more Randstad, but not completely. The counterparty is, of course, the PVV. The PVV is, just as most radical right parties, more prominent in the peripheral areas, in the more rural areas. But especially in the Netherlands, it's always interesting to see we have a divide between the previously Catholic parts, still Catholic, but secularization is a thing there, and the Protestant North. And you see that the PVV is doing especially well in those Catholic parts. Historically speaking, the left parties did less well there in general, but you see that especially with the show up of the radical right, that they are more dominant in basically the provinces of North Brabant and Limburg, more peripheral areas where the working class was always more religious, and that blocked more to the PVV. The other place where you see that the PVV is very big or grew a lot is the east of Groningen, which is like the most peripheral, Andres Rodriguez Boze would say, left behind place in the Netherlands. That had also quite a lot of governmental grievances because of gas drilling and earthquakes related to that by the government. So the geography is the south of the Netherlands, Catholic South, and those left behind places. The most interesting, in my opinion, geography is of the VVD, of this conservative liberal center-right party, because they are traditionally the party of suburbia. So they are the main demographic of their voters is that they are more well off, and therefore they are more around the cities, the small cities, the classical places where you mainly have economically right, culturally moderate kind of. But I hinted about this before, diverse, and it is not the cleaning lady that votes for the radical right, because the cleaning lady mostly has a migration background and therefore votes more on the left if they vote at all. So it's this wide, lower to middle, and especially lower educated voter that votes for the radical right. And the counter you see on the left has a high proportion of higher educated people. Generally, D66 also has actually the highest education level, but that dropped now quite a lot because they also pulled in a lot of the center-right voters. So last election, they had 70% university educated voters, and now they have around 55%. Generally, we do not see very big educational differences. We see that Christian Democrats generally are a bit older, but the intersection with age and education and gender is something that we see. So higher educated and young females generally vote way more on the left, while especially the lower educated young people also vote for the radical right. And for the center-right voting bloc, the main determinant is still income. They are more well-off, especially for the VVD, but also the Christian Democrats, who are more of a rural party, classical Christian Democrats, they are not economically in trouble, so to say.
Well, that's very thought-provoking. Yeah, to conclude this most memorable conversation, may I ask personally, as a citizen, what did you find the most interesting about this early election?
As a citizen, the most interesting and the most worrisome question is that this importance of anti-liberal democratic versus liberal democratic cleavages and conflicts. This means that the traditional political debates blur a bit, but also that we are politicizing our democracy and making people choose to either agree with parties or agree with a government that is very pluralistic and therefore not very coherent ideologically, or vote for the radical right. And I find that a very worrisome thing also as a citizen, that I think democracy should be about conflict ideas within the liberal democratic system. And if everything is either a choice in favor of liberal democracy or against it without further specialization or specification which direction you go in, I think that's a very dangerous trend.
Dear Jaap, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and perspective with us today. Your insights into the shifting dynamics of Dutch politics have truly helped us understand the broader picture of this remarkable election, from the collapse of the Schoof government and the fierce competition between D66 and the PVV to the deeper social and regional undercurrents behind the vote. It's been a thought-provoking discussion highlighting not only the changing face of the Netherlands, but also the resilience and complexity of its democracy. Once again, a warm thank you to our guest, Dr. Jaap van Slageren, Assistant Professor of Political Geography and Sociology at Utrecht University.
Thank you a lot for this wonderful conversation.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us for this episode of Votes and Seats. We hope today's conversation has given you a clearer sense of how political ideas, geography, and society continue to shape the Dutch political landscape. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, share, and stay tuned for our upcoming discussions on European elections. I'm Balint Tot. Stay informed, stay curious, and take care.